Hello and welcome to the Joe Ligato Show. I'm your host, Dr. Joe Ligato, and I just wanted to give my thoughts on the recent attempt of a coup in Russia. And really, there's five main points I want to tackle. One is we need to understand Prigozhin, the leader or now former leader of Wagner Group. He was not a military person. He was really put in charge of that organization just to have someone close to the leader, Vladimir Putin, in charge of the organization. And they were meant, Wagner Group, as a private military company that could provide plausible deniability to Russia as they worked to counter American influence throughout the world, particularly Africa was a major location for Wagner Group. And Wagner Group took on even more importance during the Ukraine offensive, the Ukraine war to protect Russian-speaking citizens of the former territories of Ukraine. However, Prigozhin, despite being a friend of the leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin, he was not a military person, and he decided to spend a lot of time on the front lines without really being rotated out. He didn't want to be rotated out. And he, I believe, had some symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. I think that he was really shaken by what he saw on the battlefield. He wasn't used to it. Remember, not a military person. And because of that, Prigozhin became increasingly erratic over time and increasingly frustrated. He wanted someone to point the blame at for the problems that they were facing. Even though they were highly successful, they were still losing people. And I imagine that Prigozhin was losing friends of his on the battlefield. And so people like Shoigu became an outlet for Prigozhin to vent his frustrations. And it was allowed to happen because of the fact that Prigozhin was in such a key position of the Wagner Group. Now, I personally believe that the PMCs, the private military companies that Russia was using, it should have been broken up into many different PMCs to have these various operations throughout the world. And by having one person in charge, someone who wasn't even a military person, but was just someone who was loyal to Vladimir Putin, it became a problem where he ended up accumulating too much power outside of the normal military power structure. And something else to consider here is it's obvious that Russia realized that he was accumulating too much power and he was acting too erratically, likely because of stress related to the battlefield. But instead of breaking it up, Wagner Group up into many different PMCs, they decided to incorporate them into the Russian military. Now, this is important, and I've not seen other channels really talking about this. We have excellent channels in this sphere, such as the Duran, talking about the situation in Ukraine, but I've not seen anyone actually specifically mention this, and that is, why did they decide to incorporate Wagner into the Russian military instead of something like having many smaller private military companies? And the reason, I believe, is because the time for subtlety, the time for plausible deniability in the face of countering America is gone. It's over with, right? At this point in time in history, it looks like Russia is competing with the West directly, pretty directly. I mean, they're both manufacturing weapons to fight each other on the battlefield. Russia knows about various military strategies from the West, from NATO within Ukraine. They target them every once in a while. And so there's a lot of evidence that Russia is removing the need for plausible deniability, because what can happen at this point? They've already been sanctioned as much as they could possibly be sanctioned. They've been removed from all different international organizations that were completely controlled by NATO. And so for them, a key thing to remember here is, yes, Prigozhin behaving erratically, unfortunate what happened with him, but the outcome for Wagner was that they're being incorporated into the military instead of broken up into many different PMCs. And that's something to consider going forward. What does that mean for the difference in strategy for Russia when competing with the United States? And so just Some other thoughts I have on this coup attempt. I mean, I do think that Prigozhin was genuine in his erratic nature, but I also think that Prigozhin was encouraged by the United States. And this could take many forms. And you might be thinking, well, why would they encourage it? I mean, he's not really a pro-Western figure. Why would they encourage Prigozhin? And it's because of the fact that the United States doesn't care who takes over in Russia. That sounds strange. It's like, well, wouldn't they want a pro-Western person? Sure, if they could get a pro-Western person. But if they can't get a pro-Western person, what they really want is just to create instability within Russia. And so they would even accept a more anti-Western person if it pitted various factions against each other. And so they want civil discontent in their enemies. Okay? They can deal with a fractured enemy that hates them more versus a united enemy that hates them slightly less. Okay? And so while Prigozhin might not have been an ally of the West if he had been successful in his coup attempt, but the simple fact that the United States could create instability, create divisions within Russia was the goal. And so for them, while this wasn't really planned by the United States and by the West, this coup attempt was very likely encouraged. And by that, I don't mean like Prigozhin was told, like, oh, you have to overthrow Vladimir Putin. It was probably a matter of there were a few people close to him who were accepting some bribe money in exchange for just saying, like, boy, you're not getting enough weapons. Or, man, they're really, like, halting us from doing what we can to keep people alive out here. And just saying little things like that to someone who's not a military person, who's on the battlefield losing friends, it can really get at them. And for Prigozhin, he probably didn't understand that these people whispering around him, rumbling discontent, were likely being paid, at least somewhat, by the West. And it might have been true to a certain extent. Maybe they aren't getting the ammunition they need. But it could be this case that all across the battlefield, they're not getting the ammunition they need. Because, I mean, it takes time to manufacture ammunition, and you have to distribute it as evenly, as fairly as possible. And so it's entirely possible that other parts of the Russian military were facing the same difficulties. But Prigozhin took it very, very, very personally. And I think part of that was exacerbated by the United States intelligence apparatus. They don't have to tell him overthrow Putin. They don't have to tell him be pro-West. All they have to do is get him frustrated about the current situation, the current war situation. And because he's not directly a part of the situation in Russia, he's not a part of the Ministry of Defense, he's not in that chain of command, there's the possibility for miscommunications. He's not talking to them on a regular basis. And so it led to a lot of problems. And those problems were very likely fomented by the West. Now, some other thoughts that we have on the coup attempt in Russia is it's an interesting coincidence that I would say the most disastrous offensive by Ukraine that they've had occurred essentially right before or at the same time as this coup attempt. And I'm really just based off of the amount of conscription going on in Ukraine, I'm really starting to think that the Ukrainian front lines just don't have the people in order to maintain the front lines, in order to handle the situation. And this coup attempt was the United States and the West trying to use their normal playbook of overthrowing governments in order to resolve this situation for their benefit. And to me, that tells me that, yes, Russia may look a little bit weak because of the fact that they had a coup attempt happen, but it tells me that the West is running out of cards. This coup attempt was very clearly not well planned. It wasn't well funded. It didn't have various parts of the government apparatus and society backing it. And so the West, I feel like, really jumped the gun on this because they needed something to hopefully distract Russia from countering the Ukrainian offensive. And it didn't work at all. And so, yes, Russia comes out looking a little bit weak because you kind of want to handle these problems internally and not let these types of things get out. It just looks bad. But this also tells me the West is really running out of options in terms of what to throw at Russia to defeat Russia. This was, I would say, the weakest coup attempt I've ever seen from the West. And it seems like they at least knew about it, if not actively encouraged it, but I do think that they actively encouraged it in whatever way possible. And so we have to consider that initially we thought this was a sign of weakness in Russia, but maybe this is a sign of weakness in the West. Next, in terms of our thoughts on the coup attempt in Russia, is this is not 4D chess by Putin. I have kind of the Slytherin mentality of how you handle problems. If there's conflicts, internal politicking going on, you handle that in-house and you don't tell people outside the house about it. And I believe Russia and China have very similar mentalities there, where they do have disputes, they have different factions, they have different cliques, arguing, etc., etc. And you can read some about this. It's very interesting. I've been reading about various cliques within the Communist Party of China. Very interesting stuff. But they don't show those arguments to the world. They don't go bad-mouthing their country. They don't go overthrowing their country in coup attempts, things like that. And so I think Vladimir Putin comes from that same mindset of you handle problems internally, you resolve them, and you hope that the resolution is the best resolution possible. So this coup attempt, while I'm going to get to it in a second, I do think it has some benefits for Vladimir Putin. I don't think it's 4D chess by him. I don't think he wanted this to get out. I don't think he wanted to have this type of problem. And I also think that the reason they didn't have things like a full mobilization was because they didn't want to have too many of their fighting age men going abroad. And yes, Ukraine's right next door, but that's still going abroad. They didn't want them to go abroad because they needed to counter any coup attempts that might happen in the Russian sphere of influence, like a Kazakhstan coup, or internally in Russia, because they knew the United States would try that playbook on them. They would try to foment civil discontent in order to halt Russian advances, Russian gains in the Ukrainian fighting. And so Vladimir Putin expected something like this. And it looks like he handled it as well as possible, but in his mind, and in my mind as well, it makes sense that he didn't want this. It was not supposed to happen, but it did happen. And so now we're going to get to our thoughts on the coup attempt in Russia from the perspective of how Vladimir Putin could benefit from this. Now, he didn't 4D chess this into existence, but there are some potential benefits, and that is that Russia is coming out looking stronger than expected. There were not various elements of society that backed Furgusion, even though he was actually a very popular figure initially before his arguments back and forth with Shoigu. And I think people like to use Shoigu as kind of a lightning rod here because they like Vladimir Putin as the leader, but they need someone to blame for the really slow advance in Ukraine. And I think there were a lot of mistakes made early on in the Ukrainian war. But I think overall, Shoigu is doing an excellent job. And Furgusion, given his attacks, I think they were somewhat effective in terms of hurting Shoigu's reputation within Russia, and I think Prigozhin was a decently popular figure. But notice that this coup attempt was so poorly planned that various elements of society really didn't back Prigozhin. There was no one that backed him, honestly. Even some allies like Kadyrov in the Chechen Republic, a sometimes supporter of Prigozhin's comments and criticisms of the Ministry of Defense, he actually came out and said, I'm going to handle this directly. We can't have this type of instability in our country. And so you're seeing that Vladimir Putin managed to rally the country around him in this time. And that tends to be what happened. This was actually something that I found very interesting about the West during the pandemic was whenever you have any type of instability, it either leads to multiple camps forming, or it leads to a rally around the flag effect. And during the pandemic, in a lot of countries, you saw a rally around the flag effect, where it was the various elements of society were working to halt the pandemic. Okay. Now, in America, you actually saw two factions, two camps forming, and they hated each other. You had the vaxxers and the anti-vaxxers, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you're not seeing that happen with this coup attempt. Russian society was not split into two camps. There were actually people who had some disagreements, but when it came to this coup attempt, they had a visceral negative reaction where they rallied around Russia and rallied around the leader, Vladimir Putin. And so I think Vladimir Putin is going to benefit from this internally. I think it made for a more unified, a more stable country. And he also got to see who, I mean, no one really came out in support of Prigozhin, but there were certain elements of Russian society that were more hesitant to immediately back Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin probably took note of who was sitting on the sidelines to see what happened. Right? Because those are the elements of society that might be persuaded by the West, by Western money, and be co-opted by the West. And so this actually was really a boon internally for Russia. Now, I do think that overall there's a lot of negatives to it. On the international scene, China is very scared of a fractured Russia, and they're very scared of a Russia that isn't pro-China, because that's a very large border on the Chinese north. And they want to be focusing on the east and southeast, the South China Sea area, and become a naval mercantile power. And so for them, this has to be very concerning that a coup attempt even happened. I mean, it wasn't successful at all, but the fact that this was made publicly available, and that it wasn't completely wiped out before anything could actually happen and it could be public, that has to be concerning for China and really the other supporters of Russia throughout the world. A lot of the supposed third world has to be pretty concerned about the fact that a coup attempt even potentially happened. But I think overall, this is looking like more of a benefit for Russia than a downside. And it's kind of funny how that happened. I mean, you saw that also with the Ukraine war. I think a lot of people on both sides either expected or were hoping that Ukraine would collapse really quickly in the face of Russian advances. But the fact that the war is actually slowly occurring, and Russia is just kind of taking pot shots at Western equipment, NATO equipment, throughout this war, is actually turning out to be a benefit for Russia. And they also resisted sanctions that were implemented over time. And so there's a lot of actual benefits that Russia is getting from things that initially should have been a downside for Russia. So the fact that this war didn't end quickly is a downside for Russia, but Russia made the best of it. And the fact that Prigozhin did a coup attempt in Russia, I mean, that's not good, but Russia made the best of it. And so that's where I'll leave you in terms of my thoughts on this coup attempt in Russia. Shocking, interesting, and I hope you liked my thoughts on it. If you did like them, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more content. You probably noticed by now that I'm upgrading my webcam. We're going to be getting a new mic, a really high quality microphone. We're doing a ton of different things to upgrade our channel. We're also making shorts now, clipping our content. So if you want to watch the highlights from all these long form videos, please go and watch that as well. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back with more videos in the future. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye.